In 1939, while Europe was preparing for another war, Stalin made a pact with Hitler to divide several countries between their two regimes. That decision paved the way for invasions, deportations and mass murders organized by the Kremlin. Under his rule, thousands of Polish, Baltic and Ukrainian civilians were detained, executed, or sent to remote camps where labor was forced. During the war, the Red Army advanced into foreign territories with a logic of conquest that included looting, abuses and reprisals. Meanwhile, within the country, purges remained active, anti-Semitism grew, and repression spread to millions. After the victory, surveillance continued, the gulags remained full, and fear occupied every space. Stalin did not cease his absolute control even at the end of the conflict. Every decision, every silence, was upheld by a system that punished without warning. How was it possible for a single man to maintain such a vast network of terror during and after the greatest war of the century? The pact with Hitler, how Stalin helped start the war. People often think that the agreement with Hitler came suddenly, but Moscow had already been feeling out Berlin beforehand. Throughout 1939, while the British and French were in talks with the Soviets to form an alliance against Germany, Stalin remained silent. Meanwhile, his officials were working under the table to approach the Nazis. The signals were clear. The Kremlin was interested in making a pact with Hitler if it helped to gain more time or territory. In April, when the French tried to speak with Moscow to form a common front, Stalin appeared cold. He was in no hurry to commit. He knew that if he played his cards right, he could gain an advantage from both sides. Berlin quickly caught on to the move. Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, was now more open to negotiating with Stalin than before. The idea was that if Germany attacked Poland, the Soviets would not intervene. In exchange, Stalin would get a share of the spoils. It wasn't said openly, but it was obvious. In May, Stalin replaced his foreign minister with Molotov, a more loyal and tight-lipped man, and that sped things up. On the 20th of August, the Nazis sent an envoy to Moscow. 2 days later, Ribbentrop arrived in person. He was welcomed with a long dinner, full of toasts, jokes, and a lot of coldness disguised as courtesy. That very night, the pact was signed. Only one part was made public, a non-aggression agreement between Germany and the Soviet Union. But what really mattered was on a separate page that no one showed, an arrangement to divide Eastern Europe. According to that paper, Germany would take the west of Poland and the Soviets the east. They were also given a free hand over Finland, the Baltic states, and Bessarabia. The next day, the world woke up to the news. British and French diplomats were in shock. They believed Stalin was on their side, or at least that he would not support Hitler. But Stalin had already made his choice. He believed that a conflict between capitalist countries would give him more room to maneuver. Hitler, emboldened by the pact, invaded Poland on the 1st of September. 2 days later, France and the United Kingdom declared war on him. But Stalin remained still. He wanted Poland to be crushed before making a move. It was not until the 17th of September that Soviet troops crossed the border from the east. They gave no warning. They entered suddenly, while the Poles were busy fighting the Germans. From that moment on, Poland ceased to exist as a state. It was divided into 2 parts, as had been secretly agreed. In the Soviet zone, Stalin ordered the arrest of thousands of officers, professors, priests, doctors, and anyone who might oppose his rule. Many were deported, others were executed in secret. In the spring of 1940, several trains transported thousands of prisoners to nearby forests. In Katyn, Kalinin, and other places, NKVD officers shot them one by one in the back of the head. Then they buried them in mass graves. There were more than 20,000. For years, the Soviet regime blamed the Nazis for that massacre. At the same time, Stalin was advancing over other areas of the map. In October, he sent ultimatums to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, demanding they accept Soviet troops on their territory. Without the strength to resist, all 3 countries agreed. Soon after, they became Soviet republics. To Finland, however, Stalin offered no deal. He simply demanded that it cede territory along the border and allow Soviet bases. The Finns refused. On the 30th of November 1939, the Red Army crossed the border without warning. The Soviets thought it would be easy, but they met with fierce resistance. The Finns, with fewer men and no modern armoured vehicles, used the terrain to their advantage. They attacked from the forests in the middle of the snow with skis and Molotov cocktails. Soviet casualties were enormous. The failure was so evident that Stalin ordered a complete reorganization. He changed commanders, sent reinforcements, and strengthened the artillery. At the cost of thousands of lives, they managed to advance. In March of 1940, Finland requested a ceasefire. It ceded territory but retained its independence. Stalin agreed, but he was left with the idea that he needed to improve his forces. The cost was high. The image of the Red Army was damaged. Germany took note. Hitler, who until then believed he would not need to attack the Soviet Union, began to change his mind. If the Red Army had suffered so much against Finland, what would happen if Germany struck first? Despite everything, the pact remained in effect. In the following months, Stalin took advantage of the situation to send key products to Germany: oil, wheat, metals. In exchange, he received machinery, technology, and weapons. Both regimes claimed to hate each other, but they did business. Each was waiting for the right moment to betray the other. Meanwhile, Stalin set his sights on Romania. In June of 1940, he took advantage of the situation to claim Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. Romania, isolated and without allies, agreed. Soviet troops entered without firing a shot. It was another piece on the map falling under his control. The diplomatic offensive continued. In November, Molotov traveled to Berlin to discuss a possible formal alliance. He asked about Bulgaria, the Bosphorus Strait, and other areas of interest. Hitler listened politely, but he had already made a decision. On the 20th of November, he sent a secret order to his high command: begin plans to invade the Soviet Union. Stalin did not know. He still believed he could stretch the rope a little further. The more time he bought, the more prepared he would be. But the clock was already ticking against him. What had begun as a pact of convenience turned into a countdown. The pact Stalin signed to divide Europe with Hitler ended up serving as the prelude to the most brutal conflict of the entire war. The strategy of silence covered up crimes from 1939 to 1940. After the division of Poland, Stalin did not stop his advance. Without warning, he began to consolidate his control over the area guaranteed to him by the pact with Hitler. The Baltic countries came first. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia had already accepted the presence of Soviet troops within their borders since the previous year, but now Moscow wanted full control. In June of 1940, those three republics received ultimatums. The order was simple: form new governments controlled by people aligned with Moscow and allow the Red Army to take to the streets. Within days, the process was completed. Elections were held with no real competition, and as expected, all the new assemblies requested to join the Soviet Union. Stalin accepted without delay. To the world, it was a disguised annexation. To the Soviets, a clean advance. Meanwhile, Stalin's eyes were already elsewhere. Romania was weak, isolated, and unsupported. Hitler had anticipated it. According to the agreement, Bessarabia was part of the Soviet zone, but Stalin went further. He also demanded northern Bukovina, which was not mentioned in the secret pact. When the Romanians received the threat, they offered no resistance. On the 28th of June, the Red Army crossed the Dniester River. In just a few days, it took control of the claimed regions, but there was a problem. Along the way, they encountered German troops also moving through the area. Although no combat occurred, tensions rose. Soviet commanders believed the Germans had crossed the agreed line. The Germans in Berlin said the same. The discussions became heated. A clash between the two allies nearly broke out. Eventually, both sides stepped back. But the warning was clear: cooperation had its limits. Hitler began to grow suspicious. Though the pact remained in effect, it was no longer as solid as before. Berlin had noticed Stalin's constant expansion. The takeover of the Baltic countries and the pressure on the Balkans raised alarms. Intelligence reports warned that Moscow was moving more troops, reinforcing its positions and seeking opportunities in other regions. In that context, Molotov was sent to Berlin. He traveled on the 12th of November 1940 with the aim of strengthening ties. In meetings with Hitler and Ribbentrop, he insisted that the Soviet Union should be part of any future arrangement. He asked about Finland, Bulgaria, the Dardanelles, and other key points. His attitude was demanding, almost defiant. Hitler did not like it. Molotov did not present himself as a partner, but rather as someone who came to issue orders. During the talks, the Germans tried to soften the tone, but it was clear that the atmosphere was tense. When Molotov returned to Moscow, he reported his impressions to Stalin. Germany no longer seemed as interested in maintaining the agreement, and he was right. Shortly thereafter, Hitler gave the green light for the plan to attack the Soviet Union. He called it Operation Barbarossa. Although the date was not yet set, the machinery had already begun to move. The non-aggression pact was still in effect, but it was only a facade. Both sides knew that the clash was only a matter of time. At the same time, Stalin continued to purge what remained in the newly seized territories. In the areas of Poland controlled by Moscow, the repressive apparatus worked non-stop. The NKVD classified prisoners by category. Those considered dangerous were eliminated. Among them were officers, judges, intellectuals, doctors, priests, police officers and teachers. One of the greatest crimes was the Katyn massacre. Although it was planned and executed in 1940, it remained secret for years. In March, Beria presented a report to Stalin. In it, he proposed eliminating more than 20,000 prisoners. Stalin signed the order without hesitation. Starting in April, the executions began. The victims were taken in groups to remote sites. Their hands were tied, their eyes covered, and they were made to kneel. Then an NKVD agent would shoot them in the back of the head, one by one, day after day. When they were done, the bodies were piled into mass graves. In Katyn, Kalinin, Kharkov and other places, the same pattern was repeated. None of the victims had been tried. For a long time, Moscow denied its responsibility. Even when the Germans found the mass graves in 1943, the Kremlin insisted it was a fabrication. Only in 1990 was the truth admitted. It was a mass execution ordered from the top of the Soviet power structure. These kinds of actions were not isolated. In the Baltic countries, purges were also carried out. Thousands of people were arrested, deported, or disappeared. Ethnic minorities, political leaders, and anyone with ties to the former government were considered suspicious. Trains departed daily towards Siberia. No questions were asked, only lists. As the regime consolidated, propaganda worked to justify every step. The new territories were presented as part of the great Soviet family. Images showed happy workers, new schools and red flags waving in the squares. But beneath the surface, fear was constant. No one knew who would be next. In rural areas, land was collectivized by force. Those who resisted were labeled enemies of the people. Their crops were taken, their homes destroyed, or they were sent far away. Churches were closed, national symbols were banned. The idea was to erase any trace of individual identity. Stalin's strategy worked in its own way. He gave no open speeches and made no proclamations. He advanced silently, step by step, while the rest of the world looked away. The British were occupied with German bombings. The French had fallen. The United States had not yet entered the war. It was the perfect moment to act without witnesses. Even in Berlin, the image they had of Stalin was unclear. Some believed he wanted to remain neutral. Others thought he was preparing the ground for something bigger. The only certainty was that in every place he took, the pattern repeated: repression, control, disappearances. But the moment was approaching when intentions would no longer matter. Hitler no longer trusted. And Stalin, though he sensed the danger, continued to act as if the pact still held value. In less than a year, everything would explode. Slaves of the Gulag, the forced labor system behind the Red Army. To understand how the Soviet war effort was sustained, one must look beyond the front lines. While the soldiers advanced, behind them were millions of people forced to work in extreme conditions. They were not volunteers. They were prisoners. In the Soviet Union, the network of labor camps was no secret. It was part of the system. Since the 1930s, the state apparatus had created a structure of prisons that extended throughout the country. Each region had at least one camp. Some were in Siberia, others in mining zones, others near factories. In each one, work was not an option. It was a sentence. The numbers were enormous. By 1941, there were more than 2 million people under the control of the penitentiary system. Many were political prisoners, others had simply been denounced. A poorly made comment, a complaint, a suspicion. That was enough to disappear. During the war, the number increased. Stalin needed not only soldiers, he needed infrastructure. Roads, railways, factories, bridges. Every project was built by forced hands, sometimes without tools, sometimes without food. The goal was to extract the maximum effort before the body broke. In the gulags, the weather didn't matter. It made no difference whether it was winter or summer. The shifts were long. Rest was scarce. Clothing was minimal. Food was basic. Those who didn't meet the quota received smaller rations. That way, they died faster. No one complained, because complaining meant punishment. Those who survived were moved, from one camp to another, from a mine to a public works project. They weren't asked if they agreed. They were simply given an order. Many didn't even know where they were. They traveled in sealed trains with no stops. They arrived at some point on the map and began to dig. In addition to the camps, there were labor colonies. These were similar but had less surveillance. That's where those who had already served part of their sentence were sent. They were also exploited. They were assigned tasks in factories or on farms. They lived in barracks, slept on wooden planks, without blankets, in the cold, always watched. A key part of the system was deportation. Stalin moved entire populations. Entire ethnic groups were relocated from their regions to remote areas. They were given only a few hours to pack, loaded into freight wagons. They traveled for weeks. Upon arrival, they were left in the middle of nowhere, to build homes, to survive. During the war, these deportations intensified. Any group deemed untrustworthy was removed. The Crimean Tatars, the Chechens, the Volga Germans. No one was safe. It didn't matter if they had served in the Red Army. Suspicion alone was enough to be erased from the map. At the same time, the system generated resources. Gold, coal, timber, oil, everything passed through enslaved hands. What was produced fed the war machine. It was a cycle. Prisoners built the military apparatus, and that apparatus then took more territory. What was gained at the front was paid for with sweat and blood behind it. The state justified it as necessary. They said it was for defense, that every sacrifice was worth it, that every prisoner was an internal enemy. There was no talk of rehabilitation nor of justice, only of production. People were numbers. Those who produced more lived longer. Those who didn't were replaced. The supreme command of the system was the NKVD. From Moscow, they organized transfers, assigned quotas, and decided punishments. Each camp director was held accountable for results. If the target wasn't met, there were consequences. Not for the prisoners, for the guards. That's why the pressure was constant. The hidden numbers are brutal. Millions passed through the camps. Hundreds of thousands died without a trace, without trial, without gravestone. Just a number in a file. Sometimes not even that. In the official records, they were traitors. In practice, they were slaves. The system did not end with the war. On the contrary, it expanded. What had begun as a tool of internal repression became a machine of total control. In the newly occupied territories, the same formula was applied. Whoever did not obey disappeared. Even Soviet soldiers were punished. If they were captured by the enemy, they were treated as traitors. Upon returning, they were sent to camps, sometimes for years, even if they had fought, even if they had not surrendered their weapon, just for having been captured. Stalin trusted the dead more than the living. He preferred to eliminate any doubt. Anyone who showed weakness was suspicious, and suspicion was enough to lose everything. In this way, fear maintained order. No one asked questions. No one challenged. Everyone knew the line was thin. The system also used informers. Inside the camps, some prisoners received better conditions if they collaborated. They reported escape plans, complaints, ideas of protest. This fed new purges. It was a chain. Everyone protected their own skin by selling out someone else. Children were not safe. When a family was deported, everyone went. Babies, the elderly, teenagers. In the camps they worked too. Some in workshops, others in kitchens, others cleaning. There was no childhood, only routine, only obedience. Diseases were common. The cold killed. Tuberculosis was normal. Wounds were left untreated, bodies weakened quickly. The life expectancy was short. Those who lasted longer did so by luck, or brute strength, or by being assigned a less grueling task. Meanwhile, propaganda showed something else. Films, posters, speeches, all spoke of unity, of victory, of fraternity. The camps were never mentioned, nor the deaths, nor the blacklists. The country had to appear strong, orderly, and just, even though on the inside it was falling apart. Hell behind Soviet lines, war crimes. When Hitler launched his offensive against the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941, the Red Army was not ready. German troops crossed the border swiftly, destroying positions, encircling entire armies, and leaving thousands of dead in their wake. But beyond the front, the real horror was unfolding in the Soviet rear lines. Stalin, faced with surprise and humiliation, responded harshly. Not against the invaders, but against his own people. He ordered that any soldier who retreated be treated as a traitor. The NKVD placed units behind the lines, not to stop the Germans, but to shoot their own soldiers if they fled. This policy was not new. It had already been tested during the purges, but now it was applied in the middle of war. Any suspect was detained without trial. Sometimes a complaint was enough, or a look, or arriving late. The order was clear: immediate punishment. Executions multiplied. They were carried out in open fields, in front of other soldiers, to set an example. Official statistics spoke of hundreds of thousands of arrests within the Red Army. Between 1941 and 1945, more than 1.5 million soldiers were imprisoned for alleged cowardice, disobedience, or suspicion of collaboration. Some were sent to labor camps, others were executed by firing squad. Meanwhile, the German advance left entire areas without control. In those regions, the NKVD entered after the enemy, not to liberate but to purge. Entire families were deported. Those who had lived under German occupation were marked as traitors, even children, even the elderly. It didn't matter whether they had collaborated or not. In Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic countries, the repression was massive. The goal was to eliminate any potential source of resistance. Those who spoke another language were watched. Those who had held office under the Nazis were executed without trial. Religious figures were accused of agitation. The purge was not ideological, it was total. Sexual violence also became part of the Soviet advance. As the Red Army entered Germany and Eastern Europe, rapes became systematic. Women of all ages were attacked, in broad daylight, in the streets, in their homes, with their children present. The commanders knew, sometimes they tolerated it. Sometimes they used it as a method of terror. They claimed it was revenge, that the Germans deserved it. But in many cases, the victims were not enemy soldiers. They were civilians, Polish, Hungarian, Romanian women, even Soviet women liberated from camps. No one was safe. Thousands of cases were documented. Some villages were emptied. Women hid in basements, disguised themselves as elderly, covered their faces. Still, the abuses continued. There were commanders who tried to stop it, but they were few. Most preferred to look the other way. In Berlin, at the end of the war, the situation was even worse. It is estimated that more than 1 million women were assaulted by Soviet troops in Germany. Many died. Others were scarred for life. The subject was silenced for decades. The Soviets denied the facts, claimed it was propaganda. But Soviet soldiers themselves left testimony. Some wrote diaries, others spoke later. They recounted how officers allowed the assaults, how women were divided among units, how no one was punished. The impunity was total. Within the Red Army itself, terror was also constant. If a soldier complained, he was sent to a punishment battalion. There, conditions were worse than at the front. They were used for suicide missions, clearing minefields, attacking without support. Those who survived were returned. Those who didn't were simply erased from the record. German prisoners of war did not fare any better. In many cases, they were executed on the spot, or forced to march without food or water for days. Those who reached the camps alive were made to work, without protection, without medical care. Thousands died during the first winter. But the most brutal events still happened in the shadows. NKVD units had lists of names. Victims were taken at night, sometimes in trucks, sometimes on foot. No one knew where they were going, only that they didn't come back. Mass graves were dug one after another, in rural areas, in forests, in backyards. The logic was simple. Anything that smelled of dissent had to disappear. No excuses were accepted. Fear was the main tool. Even officers knew that a bad report could cost them their lives. That's why obedience was blind. Orders were followed, files sealed, and things moved on. Stalin never acknowledged these crimes. In his speeches, he spoke of justice, liberation, and moral victory. He never mentioned the purges, the rapes, the internal executions. For him, anything that strengthened the state's control was valid. The end justified the method. When the war ended, many believed the terror would stop. But it did not. The occupied zones remained under surveillance. Networks of informants were created. Radios, churches, universities were all monitored. Every social space was controlled. Nothing was left to chance. Those who had been Soviet prisoners in German hands were investigated. Some were released, others sent to camps. The women who had been raped received no help. Some were accused of collaboration, others committed suicide. The trauma was doubled, first the crime, then the silence. Hunger and looting, how the Red Army fed itself by stealing. When the Red Army began to reclaim occupied territories, hunger soon followed. Soviet logistics couldn't keep up. Supply lines were overwhelmed, and the system relied on systematic looting in the areas it took over. To support millions of soldiers, Soviet command resorted to plunder. The looting wasn't improvised, it was organized from above. Officers received clear orders: acquire food, animals, clothing, fuel, anything that could be useful. Farms were emptied, stables left without livestock, carts, trains, even trucks were loaded with whatever was found. The local population had no choice. If anyone tried to hide food, they were beaten. If they protested, they were arrested. Troops entered villages with lists. They took what was needed but almost never gave anything in return. The receipts were worthless pieces of paper. They only served to mark which family had already been looted. Hunger didn't only affect civilians. Many soldiers lived day by day. What they ate depended on what they could take. Some traded watches or cigarettes for bread. Others simply forced doors open and took everything. Storehouses, pantries, ovens, everything was searched. If anything remained, it was taken. Cities were also emptied. Not just of food, but of objects: pianos, lamps, bicycles, watches, rugs. Anything that could be carried was taken. In many cases, soldiers sent packages home. They used the military mail to send everything from boots to gramophones. They did it without shame. They saw it as spoils of war. In Germany, the plundering was total. Factories were dismantled piece by piece. Entire trains loaded with machinery were sent to the Soviet Union. Locomotives, rail cars, tools, everything was transferred. In some cases, German technicians were forced to accompany the equipment. They were relocated with their families to work on the Soviet side. Rail transport played a key role. Thousands of rail cars were used to move looted goods. There were established routes from Germany to Ukraine, from Poland to Belarus, from Hungary to the Urals. Everything was coordinated. Nothing was left to chance. The looting wasn't the chaos of drunken soldiers. It was state policy. In the camps, the Soviets also requisitioned prisoners of war. They were used to load, dismantle, dig, pack. They weren't paid. They weren't well fed. Many died from the labor, not from direct punishment, but from exhaustion, from cold, from illness. They were disposable. Gold was also part of the spoils. In Berlin, the Soviets took over the central bank. They seized bullion, coins, jewelry. The same happened in Budapest, Prague, and other capitals. What couldn't be moved was melted down. What wasn't found was hunted down by force, sometimes through torture. In Romania, the wine cellars were emptied. In Hungary, the racehorses were taken. In Austria, orchestral instruments were hauled away. There were no limits. Anything of value was taken. What was useful was sent to the front. What was luxurious to Moscow? The High Command not only knew what was happening, they allowed it. Some generals made personal lists. They chose which furniture they wanted, which paintings, which china. Sealed containers were sent. Soldiers loaded them. Civilians watched. And no one said a word, because speaking could cost you your life. On the Eastern Front, looting had another face. There it wasn't about watches or jewels. It was about survival. Soviet troops took potatoes, grain, chickens. When they couldn't find food, they took firewood, clothing, utensils, anything that could help them get through another night outdoors. It was pure hunger and rage. But the looting left deeper wounds, not only because of material loss, but because of the message. Liberation came with punishment. The civilian population, already devastated by the Nazis, was now squeezed by their supposed saviors. Villages that had hoped for help were stripped bare. In the memoirs of the time, many recount how they hid the little they had. They buried flour, hid ham in the roof, disguised valuables. Some had children cry to distract the soldiers. Others fled into the woods. It was a daily struggle to keep something. The Soviets also confiscated libraries, archives, manuscripts, not just for their cultural value, but as trophies. These were sent to universities in Leningrad and Moscow. Some documents never returned. Others resurfaced decades later. Knowledge, too, was part of the plunder. Officially, the Kremlin justified everything. They said it was reparations, that Germany had to pay for the destruction. that Eastern Europe had to compensate the cost of the Soviet effort. But the looting had no limit. The useful was taken, the symbolic as well. It was revenge, but it was also systematic. The economic impact was severe. Many villages were left without reserves, without machinery, without tools. Recovery was slow. Some sectors took years to produce again. Others never recovered. What was stolen never returned, and what remained was broken. Even in Soviet regions, the looting was internal. Troops requisitioned in Ukraine, in Belarus, in the Caucasus. The Red Army made no distinction between foreign and local. The directive was to take whatever was necessary. War justified everything. The soldiers who returned home did so with suitcases full. Some carried more than they had ever owned. They saw it as a reward, as justice, as spoils. No one stopped them. No one questioned them. Silence was part of the process. The looting also left psychological scars. For many, theft became a habit. Respect for property vanished. In the post-war period, reports spoke of a rise in crime, in violence, in social distrust. It was the hangover of a predatory occupation. But the gravest consequence was normalization. People were taught that anything was justified if it came from the enemy, that the end made it right, that victory entitled you. That message sank deep. It shaped a generation and molded a culture where power had no restraint. When the Nuremberg trials arrived, Soviet crimes were left out. The looting, the rapes, the executions, none of it was addressed. The Soviets sat as judges, not as the accused. The spoils were already stored away and no one came to claim them. The useful allies, how he manipulated Churchill and Roosevelt. During the Second World War, Stalin achieved something that seemed impossible. He gained the trust of the two most powerful Western leaders, Churchill from London, Roosevelt from Washington. Both believed they could control the Soviet dictator, but in reality, it was he who used them to his advantage. Since 1941, the Soviet Union had been receiving aid from the United States and Great Britain. Planes, trucks, food, fuel, weapons, millions of tons, all for free. In return, Stalin only had to remain at war against Hitler, and he did, but he also used that aid to strengthen his internal grip on power. Churchill travelled constantly. He tried to stop the Soviet advance in Eastern Europe. He proposed plans, strategies, boundaries. Stalin listened, smiled, and then did the opposite. Roosevelt, for his part, believed in the idea of a world without empires. He saw Stalin as a useful partner, someone trustworthy, even likable. In private letters, Stalin pretended to care about peace. He spoke of cooperation, mutual respect. But in his meetings with the Politburo, he talked about expansion, control, and domination. For him, the conferences were theatre, a stage to gain time and concessions. The Tehran Conference in 1943 was pivotal. Churchill and Roosevelt travelled to Iran to meet with Stalin. There, the Soviet leader imposed his conditions. He demanded the opening of a second front in France. He wanted the Allies to attack from the west to relieve pressure on his troops. Churchill proposed going through Italy, advancing from the south. Stalin strongly opposed. He wanted the Germans to be forced to split their forces. He wanted the British and Americans to take heavier casualties, and he got his way. Roosevelt supported Stalin. The Normandy operation was confirmed. During the same conference, Stalin made it clear that Poland would fall under Soviet control. No one stopped him. Churchill hesitated. Roosevelt raised no objections. Both preferred to preserve the alliance. They didn't want to ruin the United Front. Thus, Stalin obtained a free hand to manage Eastern Europe. Stalin also used gestures to manipulate. He called Roosevelt President Franklin. He gave him pipes, bottles, souvenirs. He made him feel special. With Churchill, he was harsher, but he also flattered him when it suited him. He knew when to be kind and when to threaten. In public, he appeared as a statesman. In private, he continued arresting, deporting, and executing. While signing agreements with the West, he was ordering internal purges. While accepting aid, he was building the apparatus he would later use to dominate half a continent after the war. In 1944, Churchill travelled to Moscow. He wanted to negotiate the division of influence in the Balkans. On a piece of paper, he proposed percentages: Greece for the British, Romania and Bulgaria for the Soviets. Yugoslavia split evenly. Stalin agreed, and then ignored everything. The paper ended up in a drawer. The real pact was made with tanks. The British and Americans continued to send aid. Every Arctic convoy cost lives, but Moscow received locomotives, flour, medicine, explosives. That assistance never stopped, even when Soviet massacres became known, even when reports spoke of massive repression. At the Yalta Conference in 1945, the three leaders met again. There, Stalin achieved his greatest diplomatic victory. He promised free elections in Eastern Europe. He promised to respect Poland's sovereignty. He promised help with Japan. He promised everything, and then delivered nothing. Roosevelt was ill. Churchill worn out. Stalin arrived strong. He knew he was winning the war. He knew his troops were already in Warsaw, in Prague, in Budapest. He spoke calmly, confidently, and he got what he asked for. The maps shifted in his favor. The promises remained on paper. At those meetings, Stalin never apologized for the pact with Hitler. He never explained the invasion of Poland, of Finland, of the Baltic states. No one demanded it. Churchill mentioned it in passing. Roosevelt avoided the topic. The focus was defeating Germany, and Stalin knew it. That's why he stayed silent and advanced. After the fall of Berlin, Stalin kept everything he had been promised, and more. He controlled half of Europe, installed loyal governments, deported opponents, censored the press, closed the borders. Free elections never came, but the Allies no longer had a way to stop him. The war was over, and the occupation was sealed. The letters between Roosevelt and Stalin continued. They were cordial, filled with friendly phrases, as if everything had been fair, as if the truth were unknown. Soviet propaganda showed photos of Stalin with his friends Churchill and Roosevelt. It claimed they had saved the world together, but only one came out ahead. Churchill, years later, wrote about his mistake. He admitted he had underestimated Stalin, that he had trusted too much. Roosevelt died shortly after Yalta. He never saw the price of his concessions. Those who did were the peoples of the East, subjected for decades by a system that disguised itself as an ally. The heroes who inspired fear when victory made you a suspect. In the midst of the war, while Soviet soldiers were fighting on the front lines, another battle was taking place in the rear. It wasn't against the Nazis. It was within the system itself. Stalin saw enemies everywhere, even among his own generals. For him, loyalty wasn't enough. He demanded absolute obedience and fear. One of the most prominent names was Georgy Zhukov. He had led the defense of Moscow, the counterattack at Stalingrad, and the final offensive toward Berlin. For many, he was the true architect of victory. But for Stalin, he was a threat, someone who had earned respect, fame, and power. From the start, Stalin was wary of his commanders. He issued direct orders to the front. He intervened in plans, changed strategies without consultation. He wanted to control everything. Personal initiative was seen as defiance, and military success could become a death sentence. Zhukov achieved victories, but also made enemies. His style was direct. He gave harsh orders, punished incompetence. He didn't care about being liked. On the battlefield, that worked. In the Kremlin, it didn't. Stalin began to watch him, to listen to rumors, to monitor his movements. After the war, while Europe celebrated the end of the conflict, Stalin took another step. He removed Zhukov from his positions, sent him to a lesser post, took away his visibility, denied him recognition, accused him of appropriating looted goods in Germany, a pretext, but enough to humiliate him. Zhukov wasn't the only one. Other commanders were demoted, arrested, or forced into retirement. Some had served bravely for years, but now they were seen as potential traitors. The system didn't reward efficiency, only submission. In the archives, false reports appeared, anonymous denunciations, intercepted letters. Everything was used as an excuse to act. A misplaced comment, a suspicious conversation, an unapproved friendship. Any detail could be used to justify a purge. The families of generals also suffered. Wives were interrogated, children expelled from schools, properties confiscated. It was a full-scale campaign, not just against individuals, but against their entire circles. The message was clear: no one was safe. The return of soldiers from the front was not well received either. Many came back with scars, with stories, with questions. Stalin feared that contact with other cultures, other peoples, other ideas would plant doubt. So he imposed filters, reviews, files. Those who had been prisoners were treated as suspects, not as victims but as possible traitors. They were interrogated, isolated, sent to camps. Thousands were not allowed to reintegrate. Their experience in enemy hands marked them for life. Surveillance within the Red Army was reinforced. Political commissars were installed, NKVD agents, informants. Any officer could be denounced for doubting, for criticizing, for asking questions. Discipline was maintained through fear, not respect. Meanwhile, Stalin organized parades, handed out medals, gave speeches about unity. But behind the curtain, he was undermining the very foundations of his own army. Distrust was total. He preferred a submissive force over a brilliant one. Military academies were also affected. Manuals were changed, names were erased, history was rewritten. It was taught that the victory belonged to the party, not the commanders. Students repeated slogans. They were taught loyalty, not strategy. In the years that followed, some generals tried to reclaim their place. They wrote memoirs, sought support, but they were under surveillance. Their mail was opened, their homes monitored. They were reminded that they were alive by permission, not by right. Zhukov lived in silence for years. He did not speak publicly. He did not appear at events, until after Stalin's death, when he was rehabilitated. He returned to hold positions, but the damage had already been done. He never regained the place he once had, nor the freedom he deserved. Zhukov's case reflects a constant. In Stalin's system, personal success was dangerous. Talent had to be hidden. Obedience mattered more than victory. Suspicion was law, and power was preserved by extinguishing those who stood out. The archives reveal that Stalin had planned even greater purges. He had lists, reports, investigations. Some historians believe that had he not died in 1953, he would have launched a massive campaign against the military. The so-called doctor's plot was only the beginning. Many officers lived in fear until the end. They knew they could fall out of favor at any moment. Stalin and anti-Semitism, persecutions hidden behind victory. At the end of the war, many believed that the suffering of the Jews had come to an end. But in the Soviet Union, victory marked the beginning of another phase of repression. Far from protecting Holocaust survivors, Stalin launched a silent campaign to erase their identity, influence, and memory. During the conflict, the official Soviet narrative avoided mentioning the genocide of the Jews as something specific. It spoke of Soviet citizens killed by the Nazis without specifying ethnic origin. The goal was to dilute Jewish identity within the collective sacrifice, eliminating any form of victimhood or prominence. After 1945, this trend turned into persecution. Jewish writers, poets, and artists who had been promoted during the war began to be censored. Their works were withdrawn. Their names erased from publications. Some were arrested, others were executed. Jewish cultural organizations were also dismantled. In 1948, the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, which had worked on international propaganda during the war, was shut down. Its members were accused of espionage, treason, and nationalist activities, vague charges, but enough to justify their disappearance. Solomon Mikols, one of the country's most renowned actors and a central figure in the committee, died in a supposed car accident. In reality, he had been assassinated by Stalin's direct order. His death was presented as an isolated incident, but it marked the beginning of a series of selective eliminations. The Soviet press began using coded language. Terms like rootless cosmopolitan or disloyal intellectual were applied almost exclusively to Jewish citizens. They were accused of promoting foreign ideas, of having dual loyalties, of failing to understand the spirit of the Soviet people. The media also attacked the memory of the Holocaust. Speaking of extermination camps as crimes against Jews was forbidden. In the Nazi trials, Soviet prosecutors avoided using the word Jew. They spoke of civilian victims. History was being rewritten in real time. At the same time, the idea was pushed that Jews were overrepresented in key professions: medicine, science, journalism, art. This fueled distrust. It was suggested that they occupied spaces that should belong to true Soviets, a veiled form of institutional discrimination. The most serious case came with the so-called doctor's plot. In 1953, several doctors, many of them Jewish, were accused of attempting to poison and kill Soviet leaders. The case was built on forced confessions, fabricated evidence, and alarmist press campaigns. The accused were well known, respected, with decades of work in state hospitals. But that did not save them. They were arrested, tortured, and forced to sign confessions. The press spoke of an international medical conspiracy. It called for exemplary punishment. The public was being prepared for a mass purge. Stalin used the case to generate fear. It was claimed that Jewish doctors were part of a Zionist network, that they acted on orders from abroad, that they sought to weaken the Soviet Union from within. The goal wasn't just to punish a few, but to justify a broader campaign. In the months leading up to his death, Stalin accelerated the plans. Deportations were being prepared, trains were readied. There was talk of sending thousands of Soviet Jews east, not for crimes committed, but as a precaution. It was a veiled repetition of what he had done with other groups. Memoirs from the era reflect the fear. Families hid documents, changed surnames, burned letters. Some tried to erase any link to Jewish institutions. Others simply resigned themselves, because they knew that in that system no argument could stop an order. When Stalin died in March of 1953, the process stopped abruptly. The detainees of the doctor's plot were released, the charges dropped, the purges frozen, not out of justice but because the new leadership needed stability and open anti-Semitism was no longer useful. But the damage had been done. The Soviet Jewish community was marked, its leaders dead or silenced, its institutions destroyed, its history censored and suspicion entrenched. For years, being Jewish in the Soviet Union meant living with an invisible label, a constant vulnerability. Later testimonies revealed that many Jewish war veterans were also ignored during official celebrations. Despite their medals, they weren't invited to public events. Their names were omitted from tributes. The discrimination wasn't overt, but it was felt in every detail. At universities, unwritten quotas were enforced. Jewish students were required to meet higher academic standards. In professional promotions, their files were stalled. There was always an official reason, but everyone knew the real cause. Even emigration was tightly controlled. Requesting to leave the country could cost one their job, their housing, their social standing. Those who managed to leave were treated as traitors. Their families were placed under surveillance. Those who stayed learned to remain silent. The paradox was brutal. A country that portrayed itself as the enemy of Nazism was reproducing similar forms of exclusion. Not in concentration camps, but in courtrooms, offices, newspapers. The system didn't exterminate, but it erased, silenced, nullified. Stalin's anti-Semitism wasn't a final outburst. It was part of a consistent logic, using identity as a political tool, creating internal enemies and maintaining control through fear. With the Jews, he found the perfect excuse, and he used it until his final day. The end, death surrounded by fear and silence. Stalin had been in power for more than 3 decades, and in his final years, his character had grown even more distrustful. By 1952, he no longer trusted even those closest to him. The health of many of his subordinates depended, quite literally, on his mood. Any conversation, any glance, could be misinterpreted. The purges he had carried out in the past were resurging, but this time fear was palpable even in the hallways of the Kremlin. In the months leading up to his death, Stalin had launched a new campaign against prominent figures within the party. This time, the target was the Jewish doctors of the Kremlin, accused of participating in an alleged plot to assassinate top regime officials. The case, fabricated with confessions extracted under pressure, became known as the Doctors' Plot. Several specialists had been arrested, and others were under surveillance, while the official press stoked paranoia with headlines that fueled hatred and distrust. Stalin, convinced that even his own collaborators wanted to poison him, began to avoid close contact. He constantly changed his routine, replaced his medical team, and restricted access to his inner circle. Even those who had shown decades of loyalty could not approach him without being watched. The dictator slept little, walked at night, and wrote down names that later disappeared from the circles of power. In that atmosphere of suspicion, on the night of the 1st of March 1953, Stalin had dinner with Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev and Bulganin at his dacha in Kuntsevo. The meeting lasted until the early hours of the morning. They laughed, drank Georgian wine, and talked politics. When he retired to his room, he ordered not to be disturbed under any circumstances. That was his last clear instruction. Throughout the entire day of March 2nd, Stalin showed no signs of life. The guards were uneasy, but the fear of disobeying his order not to be disturbed outweighed their suspicion. The lights remained off. No movement was heard. By the end of the day, one of the aides dared to enter. They found him lying on the floor, unconscious, his mouth twisted, unable to speak. No one dared to call a doctor. Those closest to him, like Beria, acted with caution. They knew that any wrong decision could place them in the crosshairs. Several hours passed before medical assistance was requested, and by then Stalin was already showing signs of irreversible brain damage. The scene was kept secret. Only a few knew what was happening. The rest of the country remained in the dark, while the supreme leader agonized without effective aid. When doctors finally arrived, they confirmed that he had suffered a severe stroke. The chances of recovery were nearly non-existent. In the days that followed, Stalin remained in critical condition. The press published vague statements without revealing the true situation. No one dared to write a single word that hadn't been approved by the same men who now silently waited for his death. Meanwhile, the top leadership secretly debated the future of power. The succession was undefined. There was no clear plan, no official heir. Beria tried to present himself as Stalin's closest confidant, while Khrushchev maneuvered discreetly. Everyone knew that the first to make a misstep could be eliminated, even with Stalin still breathing. On the night of March 5th, Stalin died. There was no immediate official ceremony. His death was not announced live, nor was his body shown to the public right away. The announcement was sober, limited to a statement read on the radio. The news was received with a mixture of fear and relief. For many, terror had lived in the body of that man. His death was not just the end of a leader, but the collapse of a system built on silence and suspicion. In the following days, thousands of people came to Moscow to say goodbye. The streets were overwhelmed. There were stampedes. People died. The image of the coffin surrounded by flowers contrasted with the memory of the fear he had imposed. Those who wept didn't know whether they did so out of habit, obligation, or confusion. No one could be certain of what would come next. The archives show that even after his death, many officials didn't dare move a single paper without authorization. The system Stalin had built didn't disappear immediately. It persisted in the form of surveillance, in the party's bureaucracy, in the habits formed through decades of repression. Stalin's body was placed in Lenin's mausoleum in Red Square, where it remained for several years. His image continued to appear on banknotes, in schools, in statues, but slowly his figure began to be removed. In 1956, Khrushchev initiated the process of de-Stalinization, denouncing the crimes and excesses committed under his rule. It was a controlled, limited turn, but symbolically powerful. That change did not erase what had happened. For more than 2 decades, Stalin made every central decision in the country, from foreign alliances to internal punishments. His signature appeared on secret pacts, mass deportations, military purges, and repressive orders from the front. His influence went beyond Soviet borders. It was present from the agreements with Hitler to the forced division of Eastern Europe. Over time, the archives revealed numbers, documents, and direct orders, confirming that the system was sustained by fear, repression, and silence. Stalin died without a trial, without exile, and without being held accountable. What he left behind was a model of bureaucratic, authoritarian, and punitive power, documented in every surviving file.